Welcome to another episode of Make Me Data Literate. This is our first episode with video as well as audio, so I hope you enjoy it and it gives you another way to listen. I'm excited this time to be delving into the area of not-for-profit data and with my guest David Spriggs. Welcome, David.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's great. I'm really excited about this. I think we're going to talk about a lot of things that I get very passionate about. So my first question, who are you and what do you do?
Thank you. My name's David Spriggs, and my day job is the CEO of Info Exchange, and we're a not-for-profit social enterprise. And we've been going for a bit over 35 years on a vision of technology for social justice. So we're all about empowering the community through the use of technology and helping the not-for-profit sector have more impact in their work through the use of technology and data. And so, as you can imagine, kind of data and the subject for today kind of permeates all of our work, but maybe a bit more just about me as well as an individual and kind of my background. My love of data actually started back when I was in primary school, and
Oh,
my
wow.
um, my dad was working for a corporate at the time, and his boss thought, "Oh, these PCs might one day become something, so I think all of my employees should learn about them." And so he brought home one of the first IBM PCs from work. And I don't think he used it all that much, but I fell in love with it. And so kind of I taught myself kind of programming in BASIC, and my kind of first real data would have been like Lotus 123, if people can remember that as the
Oh,
early
wow.
version of kind of spreadsheet applications and producing, data and charts and all of that. So I loved that. Kind of went through and knew that I wanted to get into tech, did an IT degree, but then joined Info Exchange 17 years ago, and this is my
Wow.
love of that intersection of tech and data and community and bringing it all together. And I've got two kids, still part of my life, married with two kids. And guess what? Like all kids, they're into tech, data, and AI. And I kind of look at what they've got access to now versus what I had access to with a clunky keyboard and BASIC and Lotus 123. So anyway, that's a little bit about me.
That's fantastic. I'm to start off with, I am really impressed that Info Exchange is 35 years old. I had no idea. That's incredible longevity in the not for profit sector, especially. Um,
Absolutely. And full credit to our founder, Andrew Marr, who came up with this vision of technology for social justice. And so much of what we're doing today, but was just so far ahead of his time, 35 years ago. That was pre mainstream internet, and kind of these days everyone's talking about platform solutions and data, and technology as a solution to some of the social problems we're trying to solve. But back then it was really groundbreaking. So yeah, full credit to Andrew for developing that vision and starting the organization in those early days.
that's really impressive. I had no idea. It's kind of almost obvious now, but it wouldn't have been then at all. That's really cool. So you've talked about having an IT degree, but what else did you have to learn to do your work? Was there anything missing from your formal education?
I think a ton, and I've done an IT degree. I've also done a certificate in theology, and that's
Wow.
actually been an incredible compliment for the sort of work that we do. I've been fortunate. I got a scholarship to do a creating shared value course at Harvard, and that was all around kind of working in partnerships. I'm on a few other not-for-profit boards, so I've done things like the Australian Institute of Company Directors course. And last year I finished an amazing program called the Williamson Community Leadership Program that's run by Leadership Victoria. So I'd kind of count all of those as kind of parts of formal education, and all of those have been amazing. But you're right, there's just so much that the formal education doesn't teach you and that you need to learn on the ground. I think for me, a huge part of that is how you work in partnership with others. And so often people kind of talk about partnerships, and partnerships are critical to our work at Info Exchange. We work closely, obviously, with other not-for-profits, but we work closely with government, we work closely with technology providers, with corporates, with universities. And kind of the skills to do that, I don't think really get taught anywhere. Before joining InfoExchange, I was working in the tech sector and I was kind of working in the partnership space. And in technology in the sector, we often talk about kind of ecosystems and organizations working together. And it's what I've been trying to do at InfoExchange for the last 17 years now, is to encourage more collaboration and working together. But so much of that is just, the soft skills of, how do you get people to talk to each other, and how do you get people to play nice together, and how do you get people to understand other people's perspectives. So I think that's one huge piece, which is really just, for me anyway, it's been a learning by doing rather than and kind of realizing the importance of it. So I think that's
I
one of the really big things I've had to learn.
I have so many strong feelings about that. First of all, the term soft skills drives me mad because my mantra these days is tech is easy, people are hard. Like
Absolutely.
Tech is in theory at least deterministic. You get put in the same input, you get the same output. But people don't work that way, and we have all of these people in educational institutions who say, we have group projects, and so we teach people to work in groups. Having group projects is not the same as teaching people to work in groups. You can teach people to work in groups. Those are absolutely teachable skills like any other, but we don't do it. We just go work in a group, that'll teach you. That's
Exactly. You're exactly right, and it is just so critical for our work in the not-for-profit sector. Because if you talk about helping somebody in need, you know, most often they're multifaceted issues that somebody's dealing with. Yes, they might have a need for some emergency relief food, but they may be dealing with mental health issues. They may be dealing with housing issues, maybe dealing with family violence issues, and none of those things, you can solve as an individual or just one organisation. So it's absolutely critical in our sector. But you're so right that the tech is easy, or the tech can be easy. It's the people that create the challenges in our work.
yeah. Is there one thing that you wish everybody knew about data? Something that would just change everything if people understood this?
I think that it's broad, but how you can use data to really look at how do we solve some of our wicked social problems that we're dealing with as a community. So I think often people gravitate towards more the sort of heartstring stories about what's going on, and they're important.
Yeah.
But the use of data, because if you don't have the data, how do you know the scale of the problem that you're trying to solve? How do you know what your intervention should maybe be? How do you know whether, as a sector, the problems are getting better or worse? And ultimately, how do you know whether the intervention that your organisation is working on is actually making a difference or not? And if you can't understand data and you don't have effective data, none of those things. And maybe a couple of examples to kind of bring that to life. One is at InfoExchange, we operate a platform called Ask Izzy, and that helps people in need connect with services across the community. So they can use their mobile phone, it can pick up their location, and they can say, I'm looking for food, or I'm looking for housing, or I'm looking for mental health support, as an example.
Oh, that's
Um,
amazing.
yeah, and so it's an incredibly useful tool for somebody to be able to find the support in their area, and an empowering tool because you can do it from your perspective. You can read about services, and then you make the choice whether you want to connect with that service or not. But probably something we didn't anticipate when we launched Ask Izzy was the value of the anonymous data that comes out of the back end. So heartbreakingly, in the last 12 months, we've had over 8.5 million searches for help on the Ask Izzy
Oh God.
platform. And as heartbreaking as that is, it actually provides a picture of what the level of service demand is across the community. And you can look at that by geography, you can look at that by the type of service that was in demand, you can see the trends as to what's really trending upwards at the moment. Obviously, in cost of living crisis and the fuel crisis we've now got, it's so much around emergency relief and financial assistance. So that's an example of data kind of being able to help understand the problem.
And is that
Another yeah
just in Australia? That
that
8.5 million.
yeah that 8.5 million is just
Whoa.
is just in Australia in the last 12 months. Which, as I say, we say it's great people are aware of it and people are using it, but just heartbreaking the scale. So that's an example kind of where it helps us understand the scope of the problem and the service demand.
And how
But we
things are
also
changing as well.
and exactly, and how things are changing. And another for us is we provide client and case management solutions to the not-for-profit sector. There's a bit over 6,000 organisations use that platform, and so they're using that to help manage their client intake and develop case plans. But over time, that can be an incredibly useful tool to help measure outcomes. And we do that in partnership with government. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare is one of our partners in the homelessness area, for example. And you can go back and you can now look at over 10 years of data, and through
Wow.
statistical linkage keys, you can see somebody's journey in and out of homelessness. And so you can see the effectiveness of either your organization or the kind of homelessness programs as a whole, and the outcomes that are tracking for people that are experiencing homelessness or have experienced homelessness. So, that's an example of kind of where you can track, the effectiveness of the programs that you're delivering. But there's a couple of examples, but I just wish that people would take a much more holistic view of the potential for data to help in these areas.
I love the focus on actually figuring out what works, because it's something that comes up again and again in my work when I'm delivering workshops to teachers or to schools, and I say, how many times have you had some new program implemented, and it's all very exciting and everyone's really into it, and then 12 months later you move on to a new program and no one actually implements the first one. And everyone experiences that in education, and I don't think it's confined to education. It's a really broad problem. Even government programs are often not evaluated. They're released with a lot of fanfare and shiny brochures and stuff, and then they've done their job at
Yeah,
buying
yeah.
votes, and they move
That's
on.
right. And it takes a great amount of accountability for, as an individual or an organization to actually look at those things and say, yes, this worked, or no, this this didn't work.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So
it's
it takes courage to stand up and say when something hasn't worked.
it does to say, this thing that I did, that I put so much effort into, it didn't actually achieve anything. But then you can try something else, or you can improve it, or actually continue until you get impact. So that brings us to the new question that I haven't asked before, which is, are there things that data shows that you wish more people knew about?
Yeah, and I think kind of bringing back to that example of Ask Izzy that we were just talking about, I think within the general public, people would be surprised to learn that there's so many people suffering in our community, and that there's so
Mm.
many people experiencing hardship, which is up to now around 30 to 40% of our population as a country, and that growing kind of disparity between the haves and have-nots. And
Yeah.
that's sometimes spoken about, but I don't think people necessarily understand the depth of it, and I don't think people necessarily understand the data points. And when we talk about 8.5 million searches, boil that down into that was 8.5 million, individual issues that people were having that they needed help with.
Yeah.
And I just, yeah, often think that that's not really well understood in the general public, just the scale of hardship that's being experienced across our communities at the moment, and unfortunately looking like it's on an ever increasing trajectory.
Yeah. We spoke when we met about some data during COVID times that you had, that
Mm.
when the financial relief was increased by the government and then when it was decreased. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, so it links very relevantly to a campaign the sector's been leading, and the Australian Council of Social Service in particular has been vocal on this, on kind of raising the rate of, what's called job seeker,
Mm.
but basically financial support for people in our community doing it tough. So yeah, what we saw during COVID, when those rates of job seeker were increased and there were programs like JobKeeper in place, guess what? The demand on Ask Izzy for things like emergency relief food dramatically fell
Mm.
because people were able to afford to buy food to put on the table, and so they weren't needing to access emergency relief food. And I think that provides us a compelling set of data, if you ever needed one, as to why kind of increasing that level of financial support is not just a good thing to do from a social perspective, but actually demonstrably, reduces then the demand for emergency relief and other sort of not-for-profit and government services that people need to access.
Actually, tangibly effective. I like your comment, if you ever need it. Like,
That's right.
yes, well, it's astonishing to me that we need to demonstrate that this is a good idea. Like, I,
That's right.
the,
I mean, it was kind of like a randomized control trial, before, during, and after. But yes.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So we have the data and we have the means. We demonstrated that we have the means to solve the problem, and we're choosing not to do it, and that's really confronting. What are the worst data mistakes you've seen?
So I think there's a lot, but one which has obviously been in the news a lot recently is robo-death,
Mm,
and I can imagine, before this all went wrong and before the Royal Commission, somebody was probably sitting there at their desk saying, well, we have all of this data around
mm,
support that's being provided to the community. How can we make sure that that money is being spent fairly from a taxpayer perspective? And if people have
yeah.
been overpaid, what might we be able to do about it? But the way that was implemented through the use of data and automation and the hurt and the pain and the stress that that caused in community at the acute end, I think, to people even taking their own lives,
Mm,
is just an example of how not to use data and automation without the right kind of safeguards and controls, and thinking through how it's going to be used, thinking through what the implications might be, thinking through the ramifications.
and
Provide
also
in that case
monitoring.
of providing the level of support to people, monitoring exactly
Mm,
all of those things, and that clearly was a program with data, front and
yeah.
center of what they were doing. Yeah.
And the horrifying thing is we don't seem to have learned from that. We're doing the same with the NDIS, the disability support. They've brought in an algorithm to determine people's support needs, and there's no intervention, there's no oversight, and then where is the accountability? Where is the ability to solve a problem? Because there is no way to write a software system that is flawless. That's not doesn't exist, and particularly when you're dealing with these. I don't know. I'm preaching to the converted here. When you're dealing with these complex social issues, you can't reduce that to numbers and precise calculations. It's not the way it works. So you have to be able to step in and go, in this case, the system has got it wrong. And
Yeah.
they've explicitly made the decision not to do that. And it how? Why? I can't it's bewildering to me.
Yeah, I don't know. It is, and I think NDIS is again kind of a good example around use of data just in the general public and the general community talking about NDIS right now. So it is
Mm,
a hot topic of conversation from the financial impact of the NDIS, and yes, the costs are spiraling, and so yes, government should be looking to address that and what they can do about it. But you often see kind of points of data being misused in that or not provided in a broader context. So they're talking about NDIS providers who are ripping off the scheme, and I'm sure in a program of that scale,
mm,
of course you are going to see some of those kinds of behaviours.
mm.
But often the way that some of these are presented, they're not presented in the broader context. So whether it's people who are seen to be ripping off the scheme as individuals or providers, or other issues that they're trying to solve, it's a massively complex scheme. And so
Mm.
to try and have a soundbite of a little statistic which supports the view that whoever's putting it forward is trying to convey is often just oversimplistic and kind of misusing some of those data points. Yeah.
Well, that's the next question, isn't it? About data being deliberately misused, and they they seem to be taking the data that some providers are routing the system and using it to reduce services to participants who are not, by and large, the people routing the system. And
Mm.
like we're not solving the problem. We're just making it worse in some sense, in that that punish the participants for things they didn't do.
Mm.
Again, where is the logic? I don't.
Yeah. No, no,
Doesn't.
absolutely. And I think, yeah, and as we've said, I think, the NDIS is so complex to try and boil it down to those, individual stories and sound bites is just,
Mm,
yeah, often then becomes kind of misleading, even with the best intent.
yeah.
And I guess that's what I'd say about the misuse of data more generally is, often, and I'm sure I'm guilty of this as well. You've got a view about something, and you're looking for data to support it,
Mm,
and
yeah.
that will blind you to all of the other data that might be out there, and you're looking for individual
Yes.
points of data that will support what it is that you're trying to say,
Yeah.
and even without a degree of ill intent there. That's a trap that all of us can fall into.
Oh, absolutely. And confirmation bias is almost a flaw of human psychology as much as it is an issue with data. We
Absolutely.
we love it. It makes us. It's really satisfying to find some data that confirms our biases and shows us what we want it to show. And the abstract idea that data is unbiased and pure, and you can't argue with the data. You absolutely can, and you should at all
Yeah.
at every opportunity. If you haven't tried to prove your ideas wrong, then you haven't really looked at it properly.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that's the richness of, yeah, truly working with data is using
Mm,
it as the basis to ask more questions and
yeah.
understand more rather than just taking it as here's a table of data. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So, for the general public who doesn't have your level of data skill, how do we spot things like that? You said that the little sound bites of data about the NDIS are being misused. What do we look for?
Yeah, and I think that's increasingly more complex in this world that we're now living in with, dis
Yeah.
and misinformation flying at us all the time. And so it used to be, and it still is to some extent, look for reliable, trusted sources. And fortunately, we do still have reliable and trusted sources out there. We still have a publicly funded media organisation in Australia called the ABC. We have, many other journalists that do amazing investigative journalism. And so, kind of, we do have those trusted sources out there. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't ask questions about it and that we shouldn't
Mm,
question what's going on. But there is kind of that sort of reliable and trusted sources. For me, kind of, yeah, whenever looking at any kind of stats in media or elsewhere, it's always looking at what's the source of the data, kind of understanding where it might have come from, understanding, as you just mentioned before, that confirmation bias that this is probably somebody, either the journalist or more likely the story that they're reporting on from that
mm,
person's perspective that they're interviewing, and this
mm.
is more than likely going to be data that's going to be supporting their that's going to be supporting their position or supporting the line that the story is taking.
Yeah.
And then I love some of the amazing fact check organisations that we have that actually go through some of the data points. And as those organisations often find, it's not necessarily always the clear cut, green or red. This was right or wrong. It's often grey and somewhere in the middle and open to interpretation. But if
Yes.
but if anybody can help us solve that problem, I think it's one of the biggest challenges we've got at the moment with children and young people as to how we
Mm,
can how we can educate them on those sort of trusted and reliable sources, and even within that context, asking the right questions.
Yeah.
Just because you've
Asking,
seen it come through in your feed 100 times doesn't make it true necessarily.
yeah, there's a classic XKCD cartoon that refers to that as cytogenesis. So somebody says something and then somebody finds that and cites it, and so suddenly it's confirmed, and then everyone goes back to that one source. So I remember when I first started the Australian Data Science Education Institute, I was doing a lot of talks and interviews and stuff, and I was trying to find out how much data is produced every day on the internet. And I found a stat it was a really weird number. It was something like 2.5 quintillion bytes or something, which we don't talk about quintillion bytes. It's exabytes or petabytes or gigabytes. What are quintillion bytes? And everyone was using this number, and I tracked it down to one blog. It was on an IBM website, but it was just a blog, and it said, imagine, for example, that we produce 2.5 quintillion bytes. And that was it. Like, that was the source. And sometime after that, I found there's actually a research discipline called forensic, what is it? It's like research archaeology or something. It's like actually digging down and trying to find the source of some of these things that we believe with such passionate intensity. It's
And you'd love to be able to visualize what the size of that number really means, other than the number of zeros that sit
yes,
that sit on the end
yes,
of it for the data we're
definitely.
producing.
It doesn't matter whether you're talking exabytes or quintillions of bytes. No one has any real tangible sense of what that means. It's just a number. It's like talking about billions of dollars. No one has a concept of what a billion really is. It makes no sense. So we've talked about the first question you ask when you look at stats in the media. What is the first question you ask when you look at graphs in the media?
Yeah, I think quite similar. Kind of what's the source of the data? Where's it coming from? How relevant is it to the story that they're putting forward? All of those sorts of issues around confirmation bias and the rest of it. And
Yeah.
often, of course, it's how the data is presented when it's put into a chart as well versus what the raw data might have looked like. So, we've all done this over time. Is you change the scale of the graph on the on the y-axis as a very basic point to make it look like there's been a bigger increase than it might be if you actually understand what the raw numbers underneath are telling you. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a classic. And I'm always amazed when I do that in a teacher workshop. The teachers who work with data a lot are looking at it going, oh, wow, that's terrible. We don't think about it. And it's one of those things, once you start working with it, you can't unsee it. And so you start looking for it everywhere. But until you're really working with it and thinking about it as a matter of course, then you don't look for it, and you're easily fooled by a graph that, where there's a really big peak. You think, oh, wow, that's a big change. Then you look, it's like 0.0001. Maybe it's not so big. It's
Absolutely.
one of the reasons I do what I do, right? To try to make sure that kids learn that and build that into what they do. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, it's tricky. This has been great. I really enjoyed this conversation. And that brings us to the last question, which is, what excites you about data?
Yeah, I think the potential for not-for-profits and their use of data, and in the environment that we're in today, which, as you said, there is so much data out there,
Hmm.
and there's so much kind of data infrastructure out there as well, more than there has ever been before, to support not-for-profits and the sector with their work. So whether that's, better understanding what are the needs within the community, measuring an organization's impact, and to me that's incredibly exciting. And what makes me the most excited is we do an annual survey of the not-for-profit sector on the use of technology. And in our last survey, November last year, the number one priority for leaders came out as the use of data for evidence-based decision making in their organisations.
Oh, that's awesome.
And it's almost come from nowhere. If you look at previous years, it had always been around the priorities all around, well, we want to improve our fundraising or we want to improve our website and those sort of things that, are obviously important for not-for-profits and charities that are fundraising. But to actually see that kind of suddenly leap to the top, I was incredibly excited about, because that shows a real kind of shift in attitude and motivation within the sector. And I think it implies as well that people are now feeling that that's possible. You can actually have that aspiration and you can do something about it. So I find that incredibly exciting. The other, in our current environment, we've gone, maybe half an hour in this podcast and we haven't even mentioned the words artificial intelligence. And so to me, that is exciting. And yes, there are a number of challenges and people need to be aware of all of the risks and limitations of AI. But for an organisation that's actually done the work on data foundations, which is to me kind of a prerequisite to really make effective use of AI, then the use of AI in helping kind of bring insights out of that data for an organisation, I think is going to be transformational for our sector over the longer term. Given that, yes, you need guardrails in place and there are risks and challenges, but ultimately I'm an optimist for where we can go with some of that. And even the use of AI as it's evolving in helping with cleaning up some of the data and helping with coding and those sorts of tasks. So I'm hoping that's going to be an enabler for the sector in terms of making better use of the data that they're holding.
Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by data foundations? You said you've got to get the foundations right, and I completely agree. But many of our listeners won't know what that means.
No. So I think there's a perception, not just for not-for-profits, across all organisations, that AI is going to come in and it's going to be able to solve all of your problems. And because you can just ask questions in a nice natural language way, it will give you the correct answers. Whereas if you think about it from the practicalities of if you're running a homelessness service, for example, you actually need to have your data in order. So you need to be able to understand, who your clients are, what their needs are, what are the outcomes that you're looking to measure. And you need to have that information kind of structured appropriately in a system so that you can then, use that data to provide insights, whether it's using AI or not using AI. So that's what we talk about in having data foundations, actually having, those individual elements. Whatever data is important to your organization, kind of having it well organized and having it accessible.
I think that's something that might be, if I were to turn the tables and ask the questions of myself, that might be my one thing that I wish people understood about data. Well, actually, I probably have. I couldn't limit it to one. But that idea that, once you have data, you can just use it to find all kinds of stuff out really misses the foundations, as you say, that the idea that you have to have it structured and organized and well maintained, and that you can't just kind of have data from a whole lot of sources and throw it at an AI and go do the thing. I remember some years ago I was working at CSIRO and I was talking with scientists about their data use, and I was talking with some people who were designing new solar cells. And I was really excited about the idea that, they could compare the performance of the new solar cells to the old solar cells. They said, we can't do that because we haven't calibrated the machine and we don't store the data the same way. And I was like, but why? We're not taught to do that. People don't have those skills and they're not obvious. How to structure and organize your data is it's another skill that you can teach, but we don't very often, and it's really tricky. So you bring in a data scientist once you have the data, that's too late.
Yes, absolutely. And it's challenging for not-for-profits who are in resource-constrained environments. And so to actually spend the time to do that properly, is a significant investment. But, from my perspective anyway, something that organisations, can't afford to ignore anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that people are suddenly thinking about that the leaders of organisations are suddenly going, oh, we have to get evidence, and we have to really evaluate things properly, and we have to look at our data. I love that. That's
Yeah.
I
And even
wonder
more
if
so, using it for decision making, which ultimately is what you hope all data can help inform.
yes, more evidence-based decision making would be great. It's distressingly rare. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And I think just a quick little shout out as well, if there's any not-for-profits that are listening in. One of the things we run at Info Exchange is a Data Catalyst network. It's free to join, and it's for organisations who are passionate about making better use of data in their organisation. So, if you're keen to learn more about that, just have a look at the Info Exchange website, and you'll find a link to that. But thank you so much for having me today. What a wonderful conversation. Yeah, thank you.
It's been fabulous. And I second your endorsement of the Data Catalyst Network. I'm in there and it's great. There are some really good conversations. So highly recommend you jump in, and it'll really help you, level up your organization's data use, I suppose. Thanks, David.
Fantastic.
This has been fabulous.
Thanks so much.
You've been listening to Make Me Data Literate, a podcast from the Australian Data Science Education Institute. Check out the rest of our work to build critical thinking, data literacy and AI literacy at adsi.org. See you next time.